The world was falling apart, but one nation was rising. In 1929, as the global economy convulsed and collapsed into the deepest depression in modern history, a curious phenomenon unfolded behind a curtain of barbed ideology and silence. While Wall Street shattered dreams and millions from New York to Berlin lined up for bread, there was one country where unemployment was officially zero, where industrial production soared, and where, on paper, growth was not just sustained, but accelerated. That country was the Soviet Union. In a world plunged into chaos, the Soviet economy looked like a miracle. But what kind of miracle thrives in darkness? And why, despite this dazzling ascent, did it all eventually collapse into ruin and disintegration? This is the story of an empire that defied capitalism with numbers that shocked the world, of a nation that went from feudal poverty to nuclear superpower in less than half a century, and of how the very system that engineered its rise also scripted its fall. This is the Soviet economy, how it began, how it soared, and why it was doomed from the start. To understand the Soviet economy, one must travel far beyond 1917, before the revolution, before the czars, even before the word Russia echoed in the West. Its story, like many European tragedies, begins in feudalism. By the 14th century, across much of Eastern Europe, vast tracts of land were controlled by aristocrats, lords, and monarchs who had little interest in the welfare of their serfs, a labor force bound by blood, land, and decree. These peasants lived not for themselves, but for others. The product of their labor was not theirs to keep, and the laws that governed them were not theirs to change. This system, an extractive economic model, ensured that wealth flowed upward and never returned. And unlike Western Europe, where plague and rebellion cracked the foundations of feudal rule, Eastern Europe doubled down. The Black Death, which devastated labor forces across the continent, became a turning point in the West. Lords, desperate for workers, began to offer better conditions. Serfs walked away. Wages rose. Labor gained dignity. Society slowly evolved, but not in the East. In Russia, the opposite occurred. Here, lords seized more land, imposed harsher terms, and clamped down on mobility. The state supported them, knowing full well that the entire hierarchy relied on unshakable control. By the 18th century, Russia was a continental empire, vast, proud, and entirely backward. It spanned from the Carpathians to the Pacific, yet lacked even the basic infrastructure of industrial society. In 1853, it had only one railway. The economy remained agrarian. The people remained poor, and innovation remained unwelcome. Why? Because industrialization meant change, and change meant threat to those in power. This tension reached its breaking point under Tsar Nicholas II, whose reign combined autocracy, incompetence, and disaster. The loss to Japan in 1905 exposed the empire's weakness. The involvement in World War I in 1914 shattered it completely. By 1917, the Russian people had endured starvation, humiliation, and decades of suppression. They revolted, and as the Romanov dynasty collapsed, a new force emerged, the Bolsheviks, led by the exiled Marxist Vladimir Lenin. With German help, he returned to Petrograd and ignited a revolution that promised a classless society and an economy ruled by the workers. Instead, what followed was war, famine, and a brutal transformation that would forge the Soviet economic machine. To understand the Soviet economy, one must travel far beyond 1917 before the revolution, before the czars, Even before the word Russia echoed in the West, its story, like many European tragedies, begins in feudalism. By the 14th century, across much of Eastern Europe, vast tracts of land were controlled by aristocrats, lords, and monarchs who had little interest in the welfare of their serfs, a labor force bound by blood, land, and decree. These peasants lived not for themselves, but for others. The product of their labor was not theirs to keep, and the laws that governed them were not theirs to change. This system, an extractive economic model, ensured that wealth flowed upward and never returned. And unlike Western Europe, where plague and rebellion cracked the foundations of feudal rule, Eastern Europe doubled down. The Black Death, which devastated labor forces across the continent, became a turning point in the West. Lords, desperate for workers, began to offer better conditions. Serfs walked away. Wages rose. Labor gained dignity. Society slowly evolved, but not in the East. In Russia, the opposite occurred. Here, lords seized more land, imposed harsher terms, and clamped down on mobility. The state supported them, knowing full well that the entire hierarchy relied on unshakable control. By the 18th century, Russia was a continental empire, vast, proud, and entirely backward. It spanned from the Carpathians to the Pacific, yet lacked even the basic infrastructure of industrial society. In 1853, it had only one railway. The economy remained agrarian, the people remained poor, and innovation remained unwelcome. Why? Because industrialization meant change, and change meant threat to those in power. This tension reached its breaking point under Tsar Nicholas II, whose reign combined autocracy, incompetence, and disaster. The loss to Japan in 1905 exposed the empire's weakness. The involvement in World War I in 1914 shattered it completely. By 1917, the Russian people had endured starvation, humiliation, and decades of suppression. They revolted, and as the Romanov dynasty collapsed, a new force emerged, the Bolsheviks, led by the exiled Marxist Vladimir Lenin. With German help, he returned to Petrograd and ignited a revolution that promised a classless society and an economy ruled by the workers. Instead, what followed was war, famine, and a brutal transformation that would forge the Soviet economic machine. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had become an industrial juggernaut. Its growth figures impressed even Western economists. While capitalism was still recovering from the Great Depression, Soviet factories thundered with activity, smokestacks etched the skyline, and workers marched beneath red banners proclaiming the victory of socialism. But beneath the propaganda and the numbers, a rot had begun to form. At the core of the Soviet economic model was a fatal contradiction. It had mastered how to mobilize vast resources, but never how to use them efficiently. It could build a dam, a tank, or a steel mill faster than any other country. But what it couldn't do was build prosperity. Why? The answer lies in a single word: incentives. In capitalist economy, workers, managers, and inventors have a reason to do more, to build better, to innovate. The possibility of reward drives competition, effort, and creativity. In the Soviet Union, there were no such levers. Wages were fixed, prices were fixed, and jobs were legally guaranteed. Productivity, how much output one worker could produce, remained painfully low. Not because Soviet workers were lazy, but because they had no reason not to be. Enterprise managers, the men tasked with running factories, understood this reality better than anyone. Their survival depended on hitting centrally planned quotas, not maximizing efficiency. So they gamed the system. Let's say a manager was told to produce 1,000 tons of steel. He would demand far more raw materials and labor than he needed just in case. If he exceeded his target, he might receive a bonus, but he also risked being assigned an even higher quota next year, which could be impossible to meet. So instead, many managers would aim just above the quote never too low, never too high. This was not incompetence. It was rational behavior inside an irrational system. Factories were routinely overstaffed, not because of benevolence, but because supply chains were so unreliable that managers needed a buffer people to wait around just in case material arrived. When new machinery arrived, technologies that could increase productivity, it often went unused. Managers didn't want the risk. Installing new equipment meant disrupting the workflow, retraining staff, and potentially missing quotas. Better to stick with the old, even if it was worse. These distortions were not isolated. They were systemic. Across the Soviet Union, factories wasted raw materials, transport networks failed, and innovation stagnated. Workers stood in lines for hours, not just for bread, but for everything: toothpaste, shoes, light bulbs. There was no connection between supply and demand. The planners set prices so low that goods disappeared from shelves, sometimes within minutes. It was a world where abundance existed on paper, but scarcity ruled in real life. And yet, for all its inefficiencies, the Soviet economy kept growing. How? By brute force? The same way you can make a larger fire by throwing in more wood, the Soviet Union expanded output by throwing in more inputs, more workers, more steel, more concrete, more land. Between 1928 and 1940, the Soviet economy grew by nearly 6% annually, a staggering rate, but much of that growth came not from productivity, but from sheer scale. The tragedy is that this was unsustainable. There's only so much labor you can redirect, only so many mines you can open, only so many forests you can cut. Eventually, the inputs run out, and when they do, all that remains is the system's ability to adapt. But the Soviet system had been built to resist change. Its rigidity, its very strength, was now becoming its weakness. In the decades following World War II, the Soviet Union stood tall on the world stage. It had survived the Nazi invasion, crushed fascism on the Eastern Front, and raised its red flag over Berlin. In 1949, it detonated its first atomic bomb. In 1957, it launched Sputnik, the first satellite. In 1961, it sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space. To the outside world, it seemed the Soviet economic model had not only recovered, it had triumphed. But the numbers were deceiving. Growth was slowing, innovation was fading, and the cracks were starting to show. At first, the post-war years offered a second win. The devastated Western Europe needed time to rebuild, and the Soviets used that window to deepen their control over Eastern Bloc economies. Their satellite states, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, were forced to replicate the Soviet model, feeding Moscow's ambitions and industrial goals. But beneath the surface, the system was freezing in place. The key problem: innovation, or the lack thereof. In capitalist societies, innovation is oxygen. It is encouraged, protected, and rewarded. Inventors can patent breakthroughs. Entrepreneurs can profit from new ideas. A better way of doing things is always one deal, one investor, one risk away from reality. But in the Soviet Union, there was no such ecosystem. If you invented something remarkable, you couldn't profit from it. There were no private markets to adopt it, no venture capitalists to fund it, and no freedom to pursue it independently. The reward for innovation, at best, a medal, at worst, suspicion. Stagnation followed. The Soviet Union tried to sidestep the problem by importing innovation from the West. One famous example was the Avtovaz car factory, constructed with the help of Italian company Fiat in the 1970s. It was meant to produce a people's car and modernize consumer life. It worked, sort of, but it also proved something dangerous. Even the Soviet elite preferred Western know-how. This dependence stung. The Politburo hated needing capitalist expertise to survive, yet they couldn't replace it. Then came another blow: agriculture. Despite vast tracts of land and decades of collectivization, Soviet farms remained staggeringly unproductive. Grain yields lagged far behind the U.S. and Europe. To keep cities fed, the USSR had to import food, often from capitalist countries it ideologically despised. And how did it pay for these imports? With oil? During the 1970s, a surge in global oil prices filled Soviet coffers. Petrodollars masked the inefficiencies. As long as oil stayed expensive, the system could paper over its failures. But oil doesn't stay expensive forever. By the early 1980s, oil prices dropped. Domestic fields began to decline. The revenue buffer vanished. And suddenly, the true scale of Soviet economic decay was impossible to ignore. Growth had slowed to a crawl just 2% per year, even lower than in capitalist democracies. And worse than the numbers was the spirit of paralysis. The Soviet economy, once a colossus of iron and labor, had become a beached whale, massive, immobile, gasping for air. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union faced a reality it could no longer ignore. Its economy was dying, not from external shock, not from war or sanctions, but from within. The system that had once conquered Europe, launched rockets, and fueled an empire was now starving itself to death on rigidity. In the West, stagnation often leads to reform policy changes, elections, new leadership. In the Soviet Union, it led to silence. The planners in Moscow had built a world of closed loops. Prices were fixed, information was filtered, and failure was disguised as success. Bureaucrats feared truth more than inefficiency. After all, to admit a factory missed its target, or that crops failed in a given region, meant someone would lose their job or worse. So, the numbers were massaged, shortfalls were hidden, the truth disappeared from the system. But reality doesn't go away just because it's ignored. Factories continued to overstaff. Machines sat idle. Whole industries from clothing to appliances to electronics remained decades behind the West. While American consumers bought color TVs, microwave ovens, and personal computers, Soviet citizens queued for shoes and sugar. Even toilet paper became a luxury. Still, there were no mechanisms for reform. Why? Because the very structure of the Soviet political system made reform impossible, unlike Western democracies, which allowed for new parties, civil movements, and dissenting voices. The Soviet system had no release valves. There was no meaningful parliament, no independent judiciary, no free press. The Communist Party was the only source of power, and it was deeply invested in the status quo. To reform the economy meant to weaken the party's control, and the party would not allow that. This was the ultimate irony. The economy needed reform to survive, but reform threatened the very people in charge. So the system stood still. In private, high-ranking officials knew something was wrong. The military, still powerful, absorbed enormous resources. But consumer sectors shriveled, innovation lagged, growth was gone, the economy was too large to control effectively, yet too fragile to decentralize. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had become a house filled with smoke, yet every door and window was locked from the inside. Then came a new name, Mikhail Gorbachev. Young, charismatic, and painfully aware of the crisis, Gorbachev launched two initiatives that would define the final chapter of the Soviet economy: perestroika restructuring, glasnost openness. These reforms were designed to modernize the economy by introducing limited market mechanisms and transparency. State enterprises were given more autonomy. Foreign investments were cautiously welcomed. Censorship relaxed. But it was too little, too late. For decades, the system had trained its population and its officials to avoid responsibility, to fear change, to crush initiative. Gorbachev's reforms, while visionary, clashed head-on with a culture of inertia and fear. Worse still, perestroika exposed the rot. Once glasnost lifted the veil, citizens saw the extent of the lies, the fake statistics, the environmental disasters, the hidden famines. Trust, once fragile, shattered completely. And so, as Gorbachev tried to fix the economy, he accidentally unspooled the political fabric of the nation. In 1991, after a failed coup and a rising wave of independence movements, the Soviet Union collapsed. It did not fall in battle. It was not conquered. It did not run out of weapons. It simply stopped working. When the hammer and sickle were lowered from the Kremlin for the final time in December of 1991, it wasn't just the end of a country. It was the quiet, suffocating death of an economic system that had defied the world until it couldn't. In the immediate aftermath, the numbers told a staggering story. In just a few years, over 300 million people found themselves in a different country, off the border, more unstable, and unprepared for the shock of global capitalism. Russia's economy contracted by nearly 40%. Hyperinflation set in. State assets were sold off in chaotic auctions. Life expectancy fell. Crime soared. To some, it seemed that the collapse of the command economy proved once and for all that centralized planning was doomed to fail. But that's not quite accurate. Because the Soviet economy had succeeded in a very specific way, it has succeeded at building steel, tanks, satellites, nuclear weapons, and cities from nothing. It had succeeded in turning a feudal empire into a global superpower within 2 generations. It has survived invasion, famine, war, and blockade, but it had failed utterly at building prosperity. And that failure was not an accident. It was baked into the system's DNA. From the very beginning, the Soviet economy had not been designed to serve the people, but to control them. To industrialize, not to raise living standards, but to prevent another invasion. To produce not for consumption, but for survival. It was an economy of fear and urgency, not freedom and choice. It worked until it didn't. Once the initial advantages, cheap labor, large inputs, rapid catch-up, were exhausted, there was nothing left to sustain growth. Without incentives, information, or innovation, the system became a stagnant pool. The more the party tried to control it, the less it moved. And when reform came, is shattered, not bent. In a haunting way, the Soviet economy fell into the same trap as the feudal empire it replaced. Back in the 19th century, the Tsars resisted industrialization because it threatened their power. In the 20th century, the Communist Party resisted economic liberalization for the same reason. Both feared the chaos of change, and both, in the end, were overwhelmed by it. The legacy of the Soviet economy is not just a lesson in communism, it's a lesson in systems and how they serve their masters. Economic models are not neutral. They reflect the priorities of those who build them. When an economy is built to liberate, it must tolerate disorder, competition, even failure. When it's built to control, it may move swiftly, but it cannot last. Today, long after the Soviet Union has faded into memory, echoes of its economic legacy remain in former republics. In political debates, in visions of utopia and warnings of dystopia, the numbers may have vanished, but the questions remain. Can a nation truly grow if its people are not free to grow with it? Can prosperity be forced, or must it be chosen? In the end, the Soviet economy was not defeated by capitalism. It was defeated by itself. History rarely repeats itself, but it does whisper. If stories like this one resonate with you, if you believe understanding the past is key to facing the future, subscribe to Legacy Files, where we unravel the systems, decisions, and turning points that shape the world as we know it. Because every empire leaves behind a file, and every file holds a warning.